Hey everybody, it's Dr. Jensen, and we're here finishing up our final module, Terrorism in Europe, Part 3. So I thought a good way to kind of wrap things up was to not take for granted history. I wanted to make sure that the modules focused on current efforts, but sometimes those current efforts get lost in the context of where we've come from. And so I felt like this would be an opportunity to make sure we know some of what's happened historically with the US and Europe in combating terrorism. So I wanted to give you this lecture too, to put this into perspective so that you could kind of see some of why we see what we see today. So kind of the big question when we look at all these efforts on terrorism over the last 30, 40 years is Europe soft on terrorism? And to me, that's kind of an unfair question, but we'll get after it in a little bit. So the United States routinely criticizes Europe for what they call coddling terrorists and appeasing the rogue governments that sponsor them. But a closer examination suggests that Europe is not so much soft on terrorism as it is really misunderstood in its approach. So there is reason to believe that given the changing nature of transnational terrorism, which we see today, that the European way of doing things really might yield some more effective results in the long run, and we'll talk about that toward the end. But let's go about answering that question first. Is Europe soft on terrorism? No. As tempting as it is to compare Europe's generally softer approach to terrorism with America's more hardline stance, it suggests that Europe is really just more misunderstood than anything else upon closer examination. So here are the two prevailing views. So the US view takes the approach that combating terrorism is really a global war, fought on all fronts, and it focuses on international terrorism. Contrast that with the European view, where the approach is that top priority is given to home-based attacks within its borders, focusing mostly on domestic terrorism. And so you can see that both of these approaches kind of contradict each other a little bit. The US view tends to use military force. The European view tends to use negotiation and diplomacy. So we're going to talk about how these two go together, but keep in mind the US also uses diplomacy and Europe also uses military force, but these are more the predominant approaches. So there has been a lot of friction over terrorism between the United States and Europe. So in the 1970s and 1980s, it really was not uncommon for Euro governments to cut secret deals with terrorists so that they wouldn't strike their borders or target their citizens. And this happened in three different ways. The first way was extradition requests were ignored. So let's say a terrorist actor claimed credit or a group for an attack on your people or a target in your borders, and some other country nearby apprehended them. You would request extradition for them to be sent to your country for a trial, for prosecution, and potentially for conviction and punishment. But those countries might not agree and they wouldn't send them over. You also would see captured terrorists escape custody, and sometimes this was seen as more deliberate, where that country didn't want to alienate the country the terrorist was from in fear of retaliation. So we'd say, oops, they got away, kind of a thing. And then border control routines were often ignored. And so, again, you have to remember, historically, border security was very messy and difficult and varied country to country. And sometimes, it was like, well, it's so messy, why do it, kind of a thing. And so there were loose ends to tie up there as well. But this is an example of the prevailing European attitude in the 1970s when it came to terrorism. So in 1977, French counter-espionage agents arrested Abu Daoud, who was responsible for the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre that you've heard talked about in this class and I'm sure in other classes. So both Israel and West Germany requested extradition. Send him over to our country so we can prosecute. But France stonewalled, deliberated, and then set him free for fear of terrorist reprisals from the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. So there were a lot of kind of fear-mongering going on, and I think some of those fears were quite legitimate. But this was something that kind of characterized a lot of different events that we saw happen during this time period. Here's, on the other hand, an example of the US attitude in the 1970s. So in 1973, the terrorists seized 6 diplomats. These were international terrorists, including the ambassador to Sudan. So these were mostly Americans. Their freedom was offered in exchange for the release of 60 plus terrorists held in Israel, Jordan, and West Germany at the time, as well as the release of the assassin Sirhan Sirhan, who killed Senator Robert Kennedy. President Nixon at the time did not compromise and established the no blackmail, no concessions policy, which is still often followed today. So in return, these diplomats were killed. So it's a very hardline stance. We will not negotiate with terrorists. We do not respond to threats and blackmail and so forth. But again, hardline approach. So those are the kind of examples that start to embody those attitudes. So terrorism was really viewed through global interactions and prisms of the Cold War when it came to how the US saw things. But this really didn't resonate with Italy, West Germany, or Spain, who is already struggling with the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof gang, or the separatist Basque groups, respectively. So they had all kinds of homegrown terrorists that they're like, look, America, if you think that all of these terrorist groups are little factions of, Cuba and Russian influence and it's all Cold War related, that's fine. We have our own problems in our own backyard. So because these were internal problems and they were already challenging, and Europe was very dependent on Arab oil, the last thing European countries wanted was to provoke their neighbors. So you have to really think about that geopolitical position held by the EU. Diverging geopolitical interests made it difficult to find common ground in the fight against terrorism between the US and Europe. Europe also had long historical legacies as colonial powers in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And so sometimes they took different positions on where they felt Israel should be, or what the Israeli policy should be, or kind of who or what group they sided with. And this changed over time quite a bit, but that was also very, very common. So you have kind of two big approaches that we're going to contrast here. You have diplomatic sanctions versus military force. So the fragmented relationship with Libya over the past 30 years is a case in point. So this is before the Arab Spring in 2013, where Gaddafi was uprooted. Remember, he was in power for many, many, many decades and for most people's lives in that country. And the U.S. Back in the 70s and 80s focused on the removal of dictator Gaddafi from Libya by using airstrikes in retaliation for a bombing of a discotheque that was frequented by American soldiers in Germany. And it was thought that Gaddafi had something to do with this. Europe was horrified and suspected that Libya would be driven to the USSR and provoke a confrontation with the Soviets on the Western Front, and said, well, you're stirring the hornet's nest kind of a thing. What are you doing, United States? And Hoffman writes in an analysis of this event, thus, America's dramatic use of force, coupled with European fears of continued escalation, had galvanized the continent in the struggle against international terrorism in a way that years of patient negotiation and fruitless diplomatic pressure had failed to achieve. So these fears were very, very real, but the response was very different. So these are a few tension points that I wanted to bring up, which we find in the analysis of this history of how the US and Europe handled terrorism. So the first tension point is me or us, not US, but us. So do I fight for my own self-interest or do I fight for a collective community? So it's really the national self-interest versus the promotion of international cooperation and security. And both of those things are very good and very important. And it's hard to value one over the other because they depend on each other as well. So most Americans pre 9/11 tended to focus on old forms of terrorism, or what we call state-sponsored terror, which is eminent in the war on Iraq, and it very much is embodied in that war. Let's go finally get Saddam Hussein kind of a thing. France argued that a focus on self-funded transnational groups, radical Islamic cells, actually encapsulated new forms of terrorism, and that's where the focus should be. And this was really dismissed for decades by the international community. However, this argument from France proved to be really formulaic for the rise of Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda network. It became the new way of doing things, but it was very much ignored for a long time. We also have some tension points. We call them pariahs versus partners. So there were certain states like Libya and Syria, which were called pariah states, Iran, Iraq, and these were dictators with long histories of human rights abuses and state-sponsored terror upon their own people. And we take that versus potential trade partners and economic development with those kinds of countries. So even though you don't like what that person is saying, at least the conversation is still going economically. So what do we do here? This is really illustrated in the trade relationships between Iran, Iraq, and several Euro states, particularly for oil and energy development. So the US implemented the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act in Congress back in the late 90s, right before 9/11, which was ignored during business contract negotiations by the French and Iranians over the National Iranian Oil Company. So we have to remember Europe does not produce nearly as much oil as the United States does. And this was well before fracking and well before some of these new technologies made oil supply very, very different globally. And well before, oil dependence was no longer needed by the United States. So if you're Europe and you have very limited places you can drill and get oil, these business development deals are very important to you because you're a highly developed country and you use a lot of oil. So again, pariah or partner. So the argument here, when we look at all this behavior, is Europe maybe appears to be soft on the outside, but they're very tough on the inside. And this is some of what was accomplished in some of the more hardline approaches that Europe took over the past few decades. So one thing that Europe accomplished was the containment of the Basque separatists. They did lots of terrorist convictions over the bombing of a French airliner. They did mass identity inspections, sometimes 3 million people within so many weeks and months. They've done mass detainment, 70,000 people. They've done police sweeps in Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland before major World Cup events in which they arrested 100 terrorists and terrorist network raids, which, for many Europeans, this is kind of seen as looking more toward the American way of doing things. It's kind of stop and frisk and really kind of infringing upon civil rights and really rethinking search and seizure laws and those kind of things. Some of this comes from the 1976 TREVI arrangement, and TREVI stands for Terrorism, Radicalism, Extremism, and International Violence. This really was an arrangement that was about intelligence gathering and international cooperation. But this was since suspended by the Maastricht Treaty, which had a new focus on immigration, policing, asylum, customs, and really the creation of Europol in 1998, which started to kind of become at the forefront of counterterrorism activities. Now remember, Europol only at the time had a very small budget and only about 150 officers. And so it was kind of left to be said what Europol was accomplishing. Now juxtapose that to the size of the force of NYPD. NYPD actually has around 47,000 officers. So we still kind of are waiting to see how Europol works, but TREVI was actually used for a very, very long time, and it was a very good plan for getting all these different law enforcement and security ministers together to talk about concerns they were having within their borders and maybe how they might cooperate more fully. When we look at Europe's lead and some of the successes they had and some of the failures, we can see a lot of different things we can use today. So really, America's terrorist problem has usually been international, while Europe has mostly seen domestic attacks. Although both of these regions today are now experiencing terror from all sides, so we actually get a lot of amounts of both. And you could even argue that America is more focused on domestic unrest than ever before. So justifying the most extreme counterterrorism method, military force, is very, very hard to do in Europe and, somewhat hard to do in the United States. However, with the Persian Gulf War of 1990-91, I was a very young kid at the time when that happened, but I remember that. I remember a lot of parents of my friends that were deployed to Kuwait. This was actually very heavily supported by both the EU and the US, of course. And this was very effective. It actually disrupted terrorist organizations, their reconnaissance, logistics, and transnational movement to targets and training camps, even though that wasn't the primary reason that we went to war in the Gulf. It was to liberate Kuwait from being seized by Saddam Hussein. It had all these ancillary things that it did, which was really helpful. So America's hardline policies have not necessarily proved as useful, although the war in Iraq is a case in point that was. And sometimes we get into this good cop, bad cop situation where we have the EU and the US approaches, kind of one taking one stance, one taking another. But these can actually complement each other when used in a really coordinated strategy. When we do policy coordination, economic sanctioning, and threat of military force. So when we put all of that together, it can actually be really, really good. However, military force and economic sanctions alone will have very little utility on terrorist groups with no allegiance to any nation. So really, more effective law enforcement and intelligence gathering, like that Trevi arrangement, will prevail here, alongside the elimination of funding sources, regulatory tools, and surveillance technology that can kind of see what's going on very quickly and make it actionable very, very soon. So regulatory tools are kind of the things we brought up in the bioterrorism unit, where we talked about, the regulation of materials that are commonly used in bomb making. So, for example, if you're buying 2 metric tons of potassium nitrate, which is used in chemical fertilizer, you should be using it as a chemical fertilizer, right? You should be established as someone in agriculture with the authority and reasonable trust to buy such large quantities and not be sticking it in a Ryder truck and blowing up the Oklahoma City Murrah building, which is what happened with 2 metric tons of potassium nitrate and Timothy McVeigh. So we start regulating materials a little more closely, also a very good practice. To make sure it doesn't go into the wrong hands. And then, of course, surveillance technology has changed so much and can definitely be a very positive tool. This is just a reference from some of the writings from Bruce Hoffman, is Europe Soft on Terrorism, and then some of my analysis applied as well. So hopefully you found this brief history of what happened between the 70s, 80s, and 90s useful when we go to understand terrorism in the 21st century. And we'll see you next time.